Right, this is a brief guide on how to set up the ignition timing on a Monza GSE, the Senator A, and some Series 2 Monzas, in other words the ones with the velour seats, from around about late 1984 when they introduced the electronic timing control to the ignition system. The timing control module is this item here. There's several different types depending on whether you've got air conditioning and stuff, but basically they'd all work if you've got a problem. So that continually adjusts the ignition timing depending upon what the engine is doing, and it's fed by various signals. Secondly, they retained the vacuum advance and retard of the older distributor, hence the vacuum pipe and the diaphragm on the side. So these two items work together to adjust the timing continuously as the engine is running. Now if you try to set the ignition timing with these two items still working, it'll be all over the place because they'll be constantly interfering with what you're trying to do. So you need to disable them. But first, before you do anything, you need to make sure that in your Monza GSE late Series 2 with the electronic timing module and most of the Vauxhall Senators, that you have actually got the correct distributor. But they all look much the same from the outside, but there's actually at least 3, possibly 4 if you include the very early cars, different distributors. You must make sure that the Bosch number on the side is 0280, I think it is, 503001. Sometimes people fit the wrong distributor without realising. The important difference between this one and the earlier ones is that although it's got a vacuum advance which turns the plate at the top, it does not have balance weights in the bottom. If you open one of these up and look in the bottom, you'll find that although the carrier for the balance weights is there, the balance weights are not. That's really important, so you must make sure you've got the correct distributor. Secondly, the timing is set up using this raised ridge on the side of the timing casing, which is often obscured by dirt and oil, so you need to clean that off, and I usually highlight it with a small bit of white paint. On the pulley on the end of the crankshaft, which I haven't got one in front of me to show you, there is a groove the width of my fingernail. That is the groove you use to line up with this raised ridge using a strobe light. There is another groove on the GSE pulley which is much wider. Ignore that. That was used by the dealers in an early form of checking the ignition timing using this item here, when presumably some sort of sensor was pushed into it in the workshop. So it's the fingernail width groove that you need to highlight with a little bit of white paint, and that. Next, you disable the ignition timing module by pulling this plug off here, on the side of the throttle body, and you need to short out the 3 terminals inside it. I use a piece of Coke can which I've cut to shape like that, or if you haven't got anything to hand similar, just use a piece of exposed copper wire to push across the contacts. They must be shorted out. That disables the advance and retard module. Secondly, pull this vacuum pipe off so that the vacuum advance can't work. Having done that, run the engine, just flip the throttle, and the timing marks that you can see down there with some difficulty should not move significantly. They might move a little bit couple of millimeters or so as you blip the throttle, but basically they shouldn't move. If they're moving wildly like that, then it means that your electronic and vacuum advance is not disabled. You can now set the ignition timing. If you've had the whole engine apart, you can set it initially statically by taking off number 1 plug, earthing it to the negative terminal or some convenient spot on the engine, turning the ignition on, and then turning the distributor body slowly until it sparks. If you do that carefully enough on number 1 lead with the timing marks lined up, which obviously you need to do with the spanner first, that will be enough to get the engine running if you've had the whole thing apart. The precise position of number 1 lead does not matter. It could be over here. The important thing is that the rotor arm should point towards it. Usually it points towards the coil. That's where number 1 lead is on, say, a new GSE out the showroom, and that's where it should be if you're very particular about it. But it doesn't actually matter. It could be anywhere. It could be any one of these. Because if you take the distributor out and turn the shaft, you can engage the gears at any position at the bottom. Ideally, you should position it so that the rotor arm is pointing towards the coil and number 1 lead is there, like on this car. Actually, no, I'm pointing towards a different one. That's number 1 lead. Sometimes when people have had the head off and they've done all the valve timing, they get it wrong. They set the valve timing on number 1 piston instead of number 6, which is a bit of an oddity on this engine, which means that the whole thing is 180 degrees out, but you can solve that problem easily by just swapping the leads across. So if you think you've got the leads wrong and that's why it won't start, just make sure that the rotor arm is pointing towards number 1, wherever it just happens to be. So, having set the ignition timing statically enough to get the engine running, you then turn the ignition on, and using a strobe light you can now adjust the ignition timing precisely until the 2 marks on the crankshaft pulley and the distributor timing casing body line up. And you could do your clamp up at the bottom there, just below the body of the distributor, and all should be well. It should then be perfect. You can then reconnect your ignition timing module and the vacuum pipe, and then when you blip the throttle, you'll notice that the ignition, the white mark on your pulley will advance quite dramatically, and then as the engine stabilizes it will fall back a bit and then settle roughly round about the white mark on the timing casing body. That tells you that you've got it right and that the system is working correctly. And that's it.